Hello, everybody. Welcome to the San Diego ULT Aquarian series. And this kind of a loose definition of the word San Diego, which goes around the whole globe, really. And we have various speakers from different lodges and even from the Theosophical Society and independent people. And this is our best effort at the second object in the service of the first object, really, which is the second object being the study of all systems, really, but pointing towards universal brotherhood. And we have a talk today on Kamaloka and Devachan, and that'll be given to us by Dr. Eugene Jennings. And he will take us into the after-death states and beyond. So I was asked to read this reading as a preliminary reading from Jakob Burma. And apparently these are collations, and they are taken from something he has written called Six Theosophic Points. And this is actually in reference to the fifth point. And then this is all in preparation for our topic today, Kamaloka and Devachan. So Jakob Burma writes, the soul has, in the time of the outer body, three mirrors or eyes of all the three worlds. The mirror to which it turns itself, by that does it see. The entire man is in his being the three worlds. The soul's center, that is the root of the soul's fire, contains the dark world. And the soul's fire contains the first principle as the true fire world. And the noble image, or the tree of divine growth, which is generated from the soul's fire and buds forth through fierce, wrathful death, in freedom or in the world of light, contains the light world, or the second principle. And the body, which in the beginning was created out of a mixed substance, which at creation arose from the light world, the dark world, and the fire world, contains the outer world, or the third mixed principle. The right soul is in the spirit of these three worlds, as God's spirit is the spirit of all the three worlds. In the dark world, it is wrathful, stern, and an austere source, and is called God's anger. In the light world, it is lovely, gentle, and joyous, and is the spirit from God's heart, the Holy Spirit. In the outer world, it is the spirit of air, as also of fire and water, and may be used as man pleases, all unto the great wonders. The world to which he turns himself, in which he produces fruit, the same is Lord in him, and this world becomes manifest in him. The world to which the soul unites with its will desire and abandons itself, from that it receives substance in its imagination. The world into which the soul introduces its will, in the same it receives also substance, that is, a spiritual body. For this substance becomes for the soul's fire a food, or matter of its burning. All right, Gene, it's all yours.
Okay. Thank you, Jonathan. And let me do this quick share. Okay. And is that properly visible?
Yes.
And okay, so thank you all for spending a little bit of time with me this evening as I ramble on about this topic, Kamaloka and Devachan. And if we listened carefully, I mean, if we have a poetic appreciation for symbolic speech, this talk, focusing on this reading from Jakob Burma, really summarizes everything. The ability to understand how we experience different states of consciousness, how we end up in different planes of existence, what the relationships are, how we are drawn to one place or another, and how we end up with the lives that we live have all been summarized in this reading, albeit in a symbolic way. So again, our topic, Kamaloka and Devachan. If we wish to translate it in a very cheap manner, we can say heaven and hell. But as Mr. Judge tells us in the first chapter of the Ocean of Theosophy, Theosophy is shallow enough that it assures that it won't overwhelm or unsettle the understanding of a child, and yet deep enough in its depths for the profoundest minds to consider ideas perhaps that they've never encountered before. And we preface the talk itself with that because, again, we can simply say heaven and hell, bad things happen in hell, good things happen in heaven. If you're a good person on earth, you go to heaven. If you're a bad person on earth, you go to hell. And that's what we've been fed perhaps for centuries. And yet Theosophy takes a different view of those simple words. And so what we're going to do is not so much talk distinctly and definitively about Kamaloka and Devachan, but to give you an idea of everything that's related to it, what the matrix for its being is, and how we actually have some control over that. And so, in a sense, it boils down to all of that intro to say that really there is nothing that Kamaloka and Devachan does not connect to. There is nothing that it doesn't relate to. Hence, from a theosophical point of view, we are actually talking about an interrelated process, as you've heard Yakaburma say, of all things here. Ideas of Kama, Loka, and Devachan are really ideas that have to do with states of consciousness, again, related to a interconnected and interdependent web of truth. Kamaloka and Devachan, from the point of view of a theosophical view, does not exist independently by itself. We use that term web to indicate that one thing connects to another thing, and all of the teachings really are involved in just these terms, Kamaloka and Devachan. And so the traditional question or ways of approach have to do with the who, what, where, how, why, when of all of this. And so to show that this web is important, although we obviously will not talk about all these things, we cannot talk about this topic without appreciating the three fundamental propositions summarized as deity, law under its form of karma and cycles, and evolutionary expression. And as we often like to think for ourselves, if we think of ourselves as truly the embodiment of these three fundamental propositions, just like Yakaburma said in the reading, we have all three worlds within us. We are those three worlds. Then everything else begins to follow a little bit more easily. We also have to acknowledge that there are 7 principal aspects that we are typically dealing with, but also from a theosophical perspective, we know, for instance, the students that are familiar with that threefold classification diagram, that those 7 principles can be seen as 5, they can be seen as 4, they can be seen as 3, and perhaps if we get time later on, they can be seen as the 31 realms of the Tibetan Buddhist and the 30 plus odd realms of the Pista Sophia division itself. But the key point is we have to keep these realms and visions in mind when we're trying to approach Kamaloka and Devachan with any degree of relative scientific strength and understanding. Ontology is there because without understanding really what we are, how we engage in the becoming, and what our being is, without that, we really can't, again, understand how this process works. Theology is there, or the study of the divine intelligences and their role in life, because they have, from the higher perspective and the lower perspective, an active role in overseeing the very realms of Devachan and Kamaloka and even earthly life, in their role as Dhyan Chauhans or archangels or whatever terms a particular system wishes to use in regards to the intelligences that are intimate to the law of karma, cycles, and universalities that help things function. Epistemology, or the science based on the understanding of how things work, what their relationships are, the knowledge, the categories, the classifications become important because, again, they relate intimately with the principles themselves, as well as the 3 fundamentals, as well as being, etc. The study of morals and ethics and virtues, soteriology, is very important because those are the determining factors for the after-death states, as well as for the states of life and living that we have experienced and will experience. Phenomenology is important because it's about the experience, the experiential feeling and understanding, the sense of these states as well as life. Eschatology speaks for itself, the study of death, and that's kind of what we're talking about. And then cognitive psychology we threw in there more specifically because it relates to our beliefs that truly determine our life experiences, the emotional responses to those experiences based on those beliefs, and most importantly, how we interpret the experiences of life. We can interpret those experiences in many different ways, which will then have different impacts on our cognitive and emotional state, which will then allow us to live lives in different ways. Or we can have one narrow belief, and whatever doesn't fit there becomes catastrophic and destructive to us. So those elements become very important. In order to kick things off from the ontological point of view, we have a quote here from Robert Crosby that this, with the one that follows, really sets the keynote for the entire understanding of this talk. And he says, this is from Universal Theosophy, the article Sleep and Dreams. There is something in each of us which enters the state called dreams, the state called sleep, and the state called death. No understanding whatever can be had of the states into which we pass and from which we emerge, save under the idea that there is an ego, a thinker, a perceiver, a knower, and experiencer who enters the states and reemerges therefrom, and that this ego, the real man, retains his integrity throughout them all. And then when we begin to get a grip on that notion, we can ask ourselves, but then which ego are we talking about? With the capital E, or the incarnating ego as the ray that takes on the limitations that place us on this particular globe with our experience. And as we've indicated, both of them are one, they're both the same, but when we begin to appreciate the subtle differences, it helps explain things even further. And that brings us to our next quote. And this one comes from the Key to Theosophy. And HPB is talking to us about the after death states. And this first line is magnificent and extremely important. For one short instant, the personal becomes one with the individual and all-knowing ego. We should really meditate on that deeply, because it implies that although it's for one short instant and it's during the after death process, that is something that is allowable to us now. Death doesn't make it more possible than it is now. And she goes on to say that, but this instant is enough to show him the whole chain of causes which have been at work during his life. He sees and now understands himself as he is, unadorned by flattery or self-deception. He reads his life remaining as a spectator, looking down into the arena he is quitting. He feels and knows the justice of all the suffering that has overtaken him. And then the questioner asks, is there anything corresponding to this before rebirth? And she says, there is. As the man at the moment of death has a retrospective insight into the life he has led, so at the moment he is reborn onto earth, the ego, awakening from the state of Devachan, has a prospective vision of the life which awaits him and realizes all the causes that have led to it. He realizes them and sees futurity, because it is between Devachan and rebirth that the ego regains his full manasic consciousness and re-becomes for a short time the God he was before, in compliance with karmic law. He first descended into matter and incarnated in the first man of flesh. The golden thread sees all its pearls and misses not one of them. Again, from the Key to Theosophy, page 162. Now, at that point, just trying to grasp the information that we've presented in terms of the interconnections, the web of connections, the idea of these states. And again, we can keep it simple. Although it is not heaven and hell, we can just for the moment think of it in that way. Where do we go after we die? We now have to take into account a different perspective and aspect. The idea that the spiritual ego is really there for the incarnating ego to communicate with, to be at one with, its guardian angel, so to speak, its reservoir of immediate rest due to the hardships of life. It serves even a greater function. Yet the small ego that is incarnate, if that relationship is properly developed, can, as HPB says, provide us with a shield in our lives that allows us to walk through most of it untortured and how can we say, abused by what we think are the injustices of life. And so when we're beginning to understand the process of death, we've got to understand, in a sense, what that ray is about. And so we always reference page 200, a lot of speakers do in the SD, because it has that whole diagram of the three upper planes that are arupa or formless, as she expresses it on that page. And then the four lower planes through which the incarnating ego must pass and gather its, for lack of a better word, impressions in order to limit itself sufficiently such that karma is just and such that the events of past lives are shaping the very life that it's being incarnated into as due retribution, and yet provided the opportunity to change its course, its thinking, its emotional state. And so all of those four planes that she acknowledges, the archetypal plane, the creative plane, the formative matrix, and then the outer worldly plane. For those that are familiar with the table of comparisons, the Taraka Yoga system, the Vedanta system, and the Theosophical system, that outward facing principle is identified as the Manomaya Kosa, that limited ego that is directing its attention predominantly to the external world and typically forgets about everything that is going on subjectively and internally. And that's our brain-based, sentient, sensory, object-bound personality. The plane up from that, we have just called for convenience. These are words that she uses throughout the SD as well as her articles. The astral plane, again, consistent with on page 200, the formative and the matrix. The etheric aspect of the ego, consistent with the creative, intelligible, lower monastic element of the page 200 diagram, creative, intelligible plane. And then what we just simply called, because she uses that word prior to the word of Akasha, the aetheric egoic aspect, consistent with the archetypal plane. And in some respects, we can look at that archetypal plane from the point of view of incarnation as the very first assembly of those skandhas that will be the directing forces of our life. And throughout the SD, there are some places where she actually pinpoints that use and interpretation of this term. But these become important because on each principle / plane aspect of our being, we are constantly functioning. We are thinking, we are feeling, we are planning, we are fearing, we are acting things out, we are holding on to positive and negative desires, positive and negative emotions, positive and negative motives. And all of these have their impressions, whether we're looking at it from the point of view of pure passion, whether we're looking at it from the point of view of hatred, whether we're looking at it from the point of view of intent to deceive, whether we're using our intelligence in an amoral way, whether we are using our very bodies and forms and instruments and senses and muscles and organs in inappropriate ways. All of those things, although subjective and inwardly, come together in this physical world. Or as Jakob Burma says, in that outer world, all three aspects of the inner world are present. And Judge talks about that in his Culture of Concentration article, when he talks about the importance of separating these very aspects, but uses the difficulty or expresses the difficulty of that by using the analogy of the mango the pulp and the seeds and the fibers that are all intertwined. And unless there is a certain course of living, action, functioning, being, that typically remains intermeshed. And all of these elements are constantly impacting our being without us even having any significant awareness of it. That becomes important in the context of our principles, our sheaths, and the vehicles that we use. Once they are formed and we are acting through them consciously or unconsciously, we have to begin to recognize that the way that we die, the way that the principles begin to separate, is also an important factor in the process of death. Kamaloka, Devachan cannot happen with certain principles intact. And so understanding the different types of death, the way we die, the principles that are connected or disconnected become important so that we can truly follow through the process of death, knowing where one is at what particular time, what one is going through, etc. And so we've just thrown out here a few. The physical body can die, but the astral body can be alive. And so if the astral body is alive, that is not a true death. But that is the case that happens with a lot of the accidents, the people that are murdered, and the people that commit suicide. And it's interesting that the teachers say when a being commits suicide, they actually are at risk for losing their connection with their immortal divine soul. There is something about suicide that literally repulses the Atma-Buddhic aspect of that Sutratma thread, that reincarnating ego, until the course of death is naturally completed, wherein the ego that committed the suicide may or may not be able to reconnect with its own monad. And so that is a whole story in and of itself, but a very important. The astral body can die, and if the astral body dies at its normal course, then the physical will naturally die, and that is considered to be a natural death. We can consider that the lower monastic principle depletes itself before the physical and the vital or the astral is dead. And then we're looking at, although we don't want to say it is, but then we're looking at different deficits in cognitive function, in things similar to dementia or Alzheimer's, or the depletion of the brain's ability to function. And yet, the astral may still be around, the physical may still be vital and alive. You can have the physical and the astral body dying, which is typically the normal death again, but leaving what we've simply called the Kamarupic mist. That typically occurs after a period of what is called gestation. And gestation is the process of death and dying where the principles are actually separated from and each placed in the proper category that they need to be placed in order to naturally dissolve, with the goal of freeing the inner ego to experience the devachanic state. So again, certain things have to be performed before even the devachanic state is experienced, or that heavenly state, or however people wish to look at it. There are also elemental lives that are pre-human, such as those that make up animal forms and those that make up human forms but are not related to the immortal ego, that play a role in death and dying. And there is that physical death that does not destroy any of these elements. And that includes a degree of intelligence. And that leaves a different kind of being or entity on the scene. And then on the positive side, we just said there are the sheaths and the stages of dissolution of those perfecting beings, living and dead. And they may have to go through the same process, but they go through it in a very different way. And then we had just made that point again at the bottom that, again, the suicides are at risk for losing their monad forever, as the teachings indicate. Now, once we've got that, then we can see that in the after-death states, there will be various types of entities. Entities being the ego in various states of its own gestation or dissolution, in conjunction with the bodies, sheaths, or vehicles that it is using. And so we'll just label some of those the astral forms, the kamarupic shells, and the percentage of the lower quaternary elements or principles that are involved. The shades, they're shades because they are still under the influence of the monad. They have not separated yet because their death is premature, again, except for the suicides. There are the elementaries, which are beings with some degree of intelligence that have these sheaths intact. There are the elementals that can animate different residual sheaths, residual Kamalokic mist or entities, etc. And then on the positive side, there are those that are on the path, the devas, the bodhisattvas, the nirmanakayas, or the Dhyan Chohans, objective and subjective, that exist in these states. So, to basically do a little recap before we even get into the states themselves, we're looking at a web of interconnected truths that pertain to almost the entire cosmos as it relates to living life, how we die, what part of us remains after the physical death, what's happening with our consciousness, and then states. So the next phase is that we've got to appreciate what we just call the wheel of life. And even though this is just something we've thrown in and put together, we like to think of it as that circle of links. And it is the circle of links that begin with the spiritual ego and the ray before it puts on its cloak of destiny or karmic body, and how that goes through all of life and experience and the after death states and eventually returns. If we remember that quote that we began with, in that instant, the ego is face to face with the spiritual ego. That is, in a sense, a complete circle and cycle of life and experience. And so when we look at it from that point of view, although I definitely don't want to go into all of these are stages and steps and transitions, beginning with the pure spiritual ego and the purity of the ray, leaving that devachanic state, having a preview of its life with an interaction with the samskaras, generating the skandhas, as the Pistis Sophia lovingly says, drinking from the cup of forgetfulness, and then entering into the process, eventually linking up with the very DNA within the womb of the mother and becoming born into a body, into a time, into an era, into a cycle, onto a globe, into a particular race, ethnologically speaking, onto a particular continent with particular resources. All of those things are determined by karma. So again, we're back to our three fundamentals: the fact that there is something immortal in us, the fact that the law is inherent within our being, and the evolutionary force itself is affected by that law in conjunction with how we have lived in the past, how we are living today, and how we will live in the future. And then through that life back to death and the life review, which we again referenced in that second quote, wherein we see all of the things that we have been through, and then the types of death or the way we die that impacts the after death states, the disconnection of the ego from those vehicles going through those states, and then what we'll talk about in a minute, gestations and disassociations that result in the Kamarupa and Devachanic entity. And then other elements that complete that circle. So almost starting at 12 o'clock, going around to 6 and coming back to 12. That is a perpetual cycle, a wheel of life and death and rebirth that is constantly going on unless we consciously break the cycle. So the life that we have lived, the life that we are now living, all of that determines and contributes to the after-death states that we will experience. And those after-death states, whether we acknowledge it or not, are intimate to the karma that we will subsequently experience after rebirth. Meaning after we've gone through the Kamalokic state, because everyone does in various degrees of rapidity or extended traumatic duration, and then the Devachanic state. And so here we enter into the elements that might contribute. There are many, many more that we can look at, but when we're looking at, for instance, Patanjali, and most of this has come from the Pistis Sophia because they have a beautiful section on the death and dying process, how that goes on, what the results of, if we look at the Kamalokic elements, the passions, the desires, the lower cognitions, all of those things that we use every day. Do we gossip? Do we lie? Do we slander others? Do we use divisive speech and make people try to see the negativity in each other and fight each other and then sit back and watch? Again, we see a lot of that in politics. Do we eavesdrop? Do we tell lies? Are we always looking to involve superficial legal interventions and become litigious? Do we bear false witness? Do we lie about things? Do we manipulate the truth? Do we misuse the very modifications of our cognitive process, correct cognition, incorrect cognition, fancy, dream, and memory for the benefit of our own personalities? Do we engage in infidelity? Do we engage in adulterous behavior? Are we driven by lust? Are we always wanting to covet things? Are we basically just greedy? Do we think about our pride and our ego always and firstmost? Do we get jealous of others? Do we get angry with others? Do we have a love for worldly possession? Do we want to look the best, to be the best, to dress the best, and to have the most? Do we kill? Do we rape? Do we murder? With words, with thoughts, with body language, with impressions? Doesn't matter the subjectivity or the subtleness. Do we pillage? Do we use our emotions as weapons? Do we engage in evil conversation, lies and manipulation? Do we have wicked intents and motives? Do we have no pity for anyone? Do we only care about ourselves? Do we not give second thought to anyone that does not agree with us? Are we always getting angry? Are we full of wrath and hatred? And soon as someone stands against us, we want them destroyed. Think of the dictators. Think of the ones that cause trouble in school. Think of some of the policemen. Do we have destructive motives that intend to destroy others simply because we don't like what they represent? Are we engaged in cursing? And that's not just with the profanity, but that's with sending curses? Do we engage in sorcery? Do we engage in negative, detrimental prayer to kill the enemy? Do we engage in thievery? Do we rob people? Do we mentally take people's property? Are we lazy? Are we full of sloth? Are we sick in mind because of all of these negative things? Are we sick in heart? Do we persist in our personal ways to the degree that, again, anyone that's in our way, we will destroy? Do we teach and set examples based on lies, based on wrong information? Do we consciously mislead people? All of this is in this domain of Kamaloka elements. And I use these simply because these are what the Pistis Sophia literally talks about, and then talks about the hells that these types of individuals have to go through in order to be purged from those iniquities. In other words, the ego has all of this attached to it. As Jakob Burma says, it is not external to it. It is internal to it. And these things have to be eradicated from within. And so when Jakob Burma says there's the eternal fire, and that fire can burn in the dark, or that fire can burn in the light. If that fire burns in the light, we have joy, we have singing, we have peace, we have harmony, i.e., we have the Devachanic experiences. And those are individuals, again, according to Pistis, that have renounced the world and its ways. They pursue the mysteries, the spiritual mysteries, the divine mysteries, the eternal mysteries. They are full of love and compassion. They are selfless. They are empathic. They are full of sympathy. They understand. They want to help. They are charitable. I mean, if you think of the paramitas, they are charitable. They are moral. They are patient. They are indifferent to their own sufferings. They are constantly meditating on the truth. They are seeking the wisdom that allows them to live and function in the world for the betterment of all of life and humanity. They minister to the needy. They are always giving alms. They are helpful. They are full of proper righteousness. They are forgiving. They are prayerful. As the Patanjali says, purity of mind, body, and soul is their practice and their living. It is their devotion to the true, to the supreme. And they always are seeking to have right modification of mind in its use to help and teach others. So we have two different visions with mixtures in between. And for the simplicity of it, all of these Kamalokic elements, remember, are what the Indian version calls vasanas, Vasanas. And these vasanas, as Judge says in Patanjali's Yoga Aphorisms, are seed deposits of karmic formation. They are not caught up in time and space such that they simply dissipate. They have to be eradicated, and their roots are in the real being. So when we just went through the dialogue, part of a dialogue between two editors in our Wednesday class, there is a portion there that HPB talks about the causal body. And she says it's not the monad and it's not manas, but something else that's connected with both. And that causal body, or what Judge calls that body of seed formations, that registers all aspects of true motives, of energy, of love and hate, of power, of motive, of intent, of planning, or premeditation. All of those are forces that color the seeds of karmic development. And those seeds can be Kamalokic in nature, or Devachanic in nature, or that third category that we did not include, transpersonal in nature, related to a life of divine pursuit in regard to the mysteries, whether one thinks of that as being a chela, a disciple, a Christian, a mystic, a occultists trying to live life in the right way for others. But to the degree that they have laid down their personalities, and a lot of people say, oh, you can't give up your personality, this and that and the other. Obviously, in the teachings, that has a distinct meaning. But to the degree that they have, then they transcend both Kamalokic and Devachanic states. And Judge says in Eccles' pamphlet, they enter into the nature of the Tribhuvana states that include these, but then others as well. Now, since none of us live our lives typically this dichotomized, typically this pure one way or the other, we always encounter the balance. And the balance is how everything is going to shake out at the end. The ego is the determining factor. The way it lives its life, according to either Kamalokic materiality, intents, motives, passions, desires, efforts, goals, or the Devachanic noble aspirational path in various degrees. All of those seeds of actions that are recorded within our karmic nature are full of intelligence, desire, passions, and they cling to us like the expression barnacles on a ship. And they infect us. And to the degree that they infect us, they are seeds of power, seeds of harmony, seeds of disharmony. In other words, karmic seeds with power, passion, strength, force, power that extend their magnetic roots from the inner being to the projection of those magnetic lines of force, as Judge says, into the external world. Or as Jakob Burma would say, into the third world in which we are born. Keeping in mind that all three replicas are in the being itself. And so from that perspective, again, I appreciate Jakob Burma's description of the fire that burns. That fire can be dark and hot or dark and cold. The fire itself, when you begin to understand how he talks about the development of the principles, are full of bitterness, harshness, anguish, pain, suffering, agitation, which then become the very hell that we have to experience. Or if that fire is burning in the light, it becomes a glow of love, of light, of joy, of empathy. As HPB says, in that Devachanic state, there is no pain, there is no suffering, there is no ability to view anything that causes anything less than harmony and peace. And these states can be experienced fully consciously, semi-consciously, or unconsciously, as she says. And so let's now put that together with this process of heaven and hells, or the process that occurs in Kamaloka versus Devachan. So when we shared that slide with those 21 phases or stages or steps, we're now at a state where the body has died, the review has occurred, and the process of dying is occurring. And we, just out of our own poetic way of thinking for years, think of all of life as a big meal. Every meal that we have has to be digested. That means that when we take a life of food and ingest it in our being, it has to be broken down. It has to be assimilated, whether we get a bellyache or not, whether we get gas or not, whether we get regurg or not, whether we can't dissolve it or not, and it keeps going over and over and over again, it still has to be digested. In the after death states, as the teachings suggest, it is an experiential digestion. It is a confrontation that occurs because the three worlds are within us, because the record of our actions are within us, because the seeds of disharmony or harmony are within us. Those are what get dissolved and broken down, but at the same time, we go through the experience. And for those that have read the article, The Five Finer Forces of Nature, you recognize that it's just not your experience that you're experiencing in the after death state from the Kamalokic perspective, but you are also, because, as Judge says, those elementals are constantly involved in the karmic process, you are also experiencing what you have witnessed in regards to the positive or negative of what you have caused. So if you are murdering someone, you see their face, you experience their feelings, you experience their fear. How you murdered them, you experience how that would be occurring to you, on you. If you've tortured them, you're experiencing that torture over and over and over again until it is dissolved, until it is fully digested. And that is a self-dissolution process. Everything is being broken down. The forces, the energies, the passions are being released and experienced. We are getting revenge on our own selves for those actions that were induced. So we put down in red, just as a reminder to ourselves, that it's almost like a constant PTSD, a constant hellish torment sensorially experienced that is embodied into our nature and assimilated into our nature, as well as digested within our nature. And if we were going through this using the Tibetan Buddhist 31 realms, they have at least 128 hells that fall into that Kamalokic state. Pistis Sophia has at least 12 or 15, and they give the names of the Shohans that are overseeing those realms. They talk about the duration that is spent in those realms. They talk about whether it's a realm of fire, a realm of cold. They talk about how the dismemberment occurs. They talk about what the ego experiences, because remember, death as a digestive process means that everything the ego has connected to it has to be released and dissolved within its being. We don't get away with anything. And so, again, I enjoy the Pistis Sophia rendition, because once they explain the different steps of this process, we can trace it back to the etheric ego, the astral ego, the physical ego, and we can look at the phase of destruction, of dissolution, where that ego is at in regards to what is called its gestation, when the positive is being separated out from the negative. And in the Pistis Sophia, when that has occurred, even if it takes centuries, based upon the nature of the ego and what they've done, once that occurs, the products that have been broken down now turn into skandhas. So not only have we had to experience what we've done on life, we are now going to have to experience the affinities that those tendencies bring to us. Because why? When we look at that circle, that fourth or fifth stage is the taking up of the very skandhas that we have digested and broken down. We don't just get rid of them, they have to be worked through. And so it says when that process is done, then the Virgin of Light in the Pistis Sophia looks at the light that has been separated from its dregs and debris. And if it is worthy, and if there is any percentage of the light left, and we just metaphorize this by saying the ego in the beginning is 100%. When it gets back to that Kamalokic state and goes through that Kamalokic state, there may be only 10% left, which means that's not much for a Devachanic experience, but that Virgin of Light will take the remaining light and send it into that Devachanic state for the goodness that it has engaged in. And then that cycle will repeat. They will have that vision. They will know the justice of that. They will know the justice of the skandhas that they have to pick up. And that subsequent phase of reincarnation will occur after the Devachanic state. If they are in that Devachanic state again, all of those good things that they've done, those positive impressions, those positive aspirations, those spiritual efforts, those spiritual studies, all of that also gets dissolved through the Devachanic experience and integrated into the very permanent character of the being on that Sutratma thread. So on the one hand, we have positive traits that are embedded within our being that will be with us inherently when we reincarnate. And then from the Kamalokic state, we will have skandhas that we are picking up that will bring us a lot of hell, turmoil, and obstructions in our life. And typically it's the balance of the two that will determine where we are born, what race we are born into, what the resources we will have available to us, what the sex we are in being born into is, the lifespan itself, the nature of the species, the diseases that we will be born with, the positive traits and gifts and abilities that we will be born with. All of that is karmically, beautifully, harmoniously balanced as that ego is coming back into existence. And then from that point, we can understand that there is a full digestion of all of our actions, of all of our motives, of all of our thoughts, of all of our speech, of all of our wishes. And there is the release of the monastic light, as we said, to the Devachanic state, or if one is on the path, that is a higher release, because it is part of a transpersonal ego that is pursuing a whole different course of evolutionary life and existence. But still, in that Devachanic state, which is where most of us go, it is one of blissful, pain-free experience. And then to point, at least as we end, to the path of the chelas, disciples, initiates, wannabes, aspirants, adepts, we can read this. And this again is from the Pistis Sophia. And this is Jesus speaking to the disciples in regards to the mysteries of the light. And those mysteries of the light go up to the ineffable in regards to initiations. And he speaks about the mysteries of the light, the fire baptism, the baptism of the Holy Spirit, and the spiritual chrism. And that chrism represents a threefold initiation in the Catholic tradition, and we can only appreciate deeply what that would mean in the Theosophical tradition. And that quote is as follows: "There is no mystery which is more excellent than these mysteries on which ye question, in that it will lead your souls into the light of the lights, into the regions of truth and goodness, into the region in which, excuse the double N, there is neither female nor male, nor are there forms." And you can remember page 200, Secret Doctrine, the formless threefold planes. "Nor are there forms in that region, but a perpetual, indescribable light. Nothing more excellent is there, therefore, than the mystery of the seen voices and their 49 powers and their ciphers. And there is no name which is more excellent than them all, the name in which are all names and all lights and all powers. Who then knoweth that name, if he cometh out of the body of matter? Nor smoke, nor darkness, nor authority, nor ruler of the fate sphere, nor angel, nor archangel, nor power can hold down the soul which knoweth that name." And we can think of the Bhagavad Gita when Krishna is speaking about when one departs in the dark and the smoke versus the light. Again, all of these teachings point to a very similar end. But on that note, then we will, again, just sum up and point out that in the very beginning, we spoke about Robert Crosby's statement in terms of the spiritual ego that knows all of these states. And then it makes great sense to us that the adepts say they have to consciously go through all of these states in terms of their initiations consciously. We've seen the cycle of life that we go through, the pre-life review, the affiliation with the DNA, the birth in the womb, the gestation, the awakening of the manas, the living of our lives, and the choices that we have to make for karma moving forward. And then the death process and how we go through that and how it becomes a real process that is scientifically, in spiritual terminology, a process of assimilation that makes us what we are, such that we can understand Krishna telling us in the Gita that we will inevitably meet that knowledge that we had in a past life if we are on this path of pursuit. And it will be there coming back to the front in our current life. So on that note, thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome.
You took us around the world.
Nothing like circles and cycles.
Yeah, I like what you said about 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock, etc. It just makes it seem just so natural, just going through just
Yeah.
going through the clock.
Let me stop share here. Hold on. Okay. All righty.
Does anybody have any questions? Laura?
Well, in Jakob Burma's work there, when he's talking about the seven voices, is that can we correlate that with the voice of the silence and page 11 at the beginning, where it talks about the seven sounds and the seven manners and how we have to hear them all and then make them into one and lay them at the master's feet. And does it correlate with that? And if it does, would that sort of mean to hear the seven sounds means that we have to be aware that we are not those principles, but that we are that one light. And so oftentimes we're kind of during an incarnation buried alive in the seven principles, you know? And so is this what Jakob Burma is speaking of when he speaks in that way with the seven voices?
Okay, so is this or can number one, the quote actually from Pistis, and that was a quote that HPB uses also in the SD, but she took it from Pistis. The seven sounds, the seven voices, the seven names, even the seven vowels. And so, can we correlate that with the voice of the silence and the stages of the seven sounds? Simply, yes. But we also have to acknowledge that the use of that phrase applies equally to the universe. And the context that it was used in the pistis, in fact, pertained to the topography of the universe. And so macrocosmically, microcosmically, intrapersonally, there's always the correlation, the correspondence. And so if we make our adjustments, then yes, we can clearly see the echo of that same primordial pattern, the true paradigmatic image, the true trans-archetypal image that is reflected in the archetypal image. And I'm using those terms because in Pistis Sophia's commentary by HPB, she tells us to look out for the repeating patterns. And so those seven sounds, those seven voices, those seven vowels, those seven powers, those seven principles, those seven states of cognitive appreciation, those seven states and conditions of the ego, all relate to those seven sounds when we're trying to integrate the web of theosophical teaching to embrace that ocean as best we can. Judy, your hand is up.
Yes, thank you for a wonderful, profound presentation. Could we say that in a sense that people who have not yet focused their consciousness to turn toward the light oscillate between a Devachanic and a Kamalokic state all the time? They either want pleasure, like spend all their day at the beach and have a great time, or are dragged down into a state like that of the alcoholic, where they're so caught up in elementals and suffering. I remember a friend of mine who was an alcoholic once referred to life as just hell, and he couldn't get out of it. He finally went to AA, fortunately. And it seems like there's an analogy that I think Jakob Berman draws it, that there are planets in the outer darkness and they're trying to rotate in, but it takes them a long time. And then there, of course, that are those that are nearer the sun in the light. But it seems that what we need to do, as the voice of the silence tells us, is that to focus our consciousness, because consciousness always moves. And so when we meditate, we are not doing nothing. We are, in fact, actively moving toward a light consciousness, which is neither Devachanic or Kamalokic. Is this what, in a sense, the voice is trying to teach us?
Okay, thanks. A lot of information there, a lot of comments and statements, and so I would just say yes, 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 yes. And two things, I guess, I would just point to again. One is Jakob Burma's statement in the beginning: all three worlds exist within us. And so when we begin to look at that from the point of view of the samskaras and the skandhas, we carry heaven and hell within.
Hmm.
And the light unavoidably must be obscured based on those skandhas, unless there is a volitional conscious effort made. Most of us can't make that effort. Most of us can't sustain that vision. So when you mention life, the meditation, I think of Judge's lifetime meditation. Because unless we are constantly, as per the paramita, persevering, constantly practicing, constantly being vigilant, catching our own erroneous impulses and thoughts and urges and personal driving forces and capping them or transforming them, then we always, as you said, are bouncing back and forth between a pseudo heaven and a legitimate hell. And we do that because, again, those are our skandhas. Unless through proper meditation, proper reflection, we learn how to disidentify in a healthy way with the content, isolate, as Patanjali says, the egoic light, experience whatever karma we have to, and at the same time lay down through ekagrata, one-pointedness, and nirodha, the stabilization of the mind, the clarification of the mind, and the avoidance of samprajnata, useless knowledge, in order to see the light, turn towards the light, reflect on the light, and be assimilated within that light. And so the teachings present that whole wheel, again, that whole picture of how that can be done. And even if it's difficult, how to start. Those devotional books, Light on the Path, the Bhagavad Gita, the Voice of the Silence, and the Dhammapada, as well as the references that she gives us in the Kita Theosophy to the Buddha ethics, the sutras and the tantras in the healthier sense, and the mantras in the conventional sense of the philosophy and the proper views. All of that is there to help us minimize our misidentifications, our erroneous thinking, and the indulgence in wrong paths. Laura, I think your hand is up again.
Well, you mentioned the word perseverance, and I think Jakob Burma uses that quite a bit. And the first quote that you did from HPB that you told us to pay specific attention to, I was wondering if you could reread that first, that one line.
From HPB or
I think it was
Crosby?
Crosby.
Okay, so that was from Universal Theosophy. Was that the one that says there is something in each of us?
Yes.
Okay, it says there is something in each of us which enters the state called dreams, the state called sleep, and the state called death. No understanding whatever can be had of the states into which we pass and from which we emerge, save under the idea that there is an ego, a thinker, a perceiver, a knower, and experiencer, who enters the states and re-emerges therefrom, and that this ego, the real man, retains his integrity throughout them all.
Right. And I think there was just a one-line one above that.
But there was another one from HPB.
Yeah, what's that one say?
Short instant, the personal becomes one with the individual and all-knowing ego.
Right. So in regard to that, then it seems that most of us would have that that experience at some point in our lives, awareness, but we're not able to sustain that awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And in looking at a quote from Jakob Burma, he says, "By my own powers, I'm as blind as the next man and can do nothing. But through the Spirit of God, my own inborn spirit pierces all things, though not always with enough perseverance,"
Mm-hmm.
as you mentioned. And so, how do we understand that in relationship to what Mr. Crosby said and what HPB says in that line?
Okay. And so how do we understand that comment by Jakob Burma? Basically, I can't do everything that I wish I could do all the time with that perseverance. And we can understand that from the perspective of the spiritual ego in capital letters versus the egoic ray. And that ray, as HPB says, does insert itself literally in a certain percentage of its being in the central nervous system. There is a ray that is in that cognitive faculty as well as in our heart. And when we are living primarily in our heads, that obstacle that Jakob Burma talks about is always going to be there. HPB tells us that in Isis Unveiled, when she is telling us the 10 properties of magic, a couple of pages after that, she says, this sentient principle, which is why we use that term at the bottom, is one or embedded in the brain. In its ethereal properties, it is not limited to the brain. And so the initiate with that information is constantly, perseveringly, vigilantly working to enhance the strength and clarity of the ethereal portions of that, to exercise those, such that the visions that it encounters are not dependent on death and dying or near-death experiences, but becomes a constant, perpetual communication with one's spiritual ego. That spiritual ego being called God by some, but it's not. The archangel, one's twin, one's higher self, and we'll have to put that in quotes because she uses that term in different ways. But the bottom line is that there is a direct route. The term often used is the Antaskadana, or the pipeline. That pipeline can be clogged and dirtied and muddied, and the light just reflects and returns to itself and gets nowhere because it's stuck, or it can be clear and unobstructed. And then, as HPB tells us in the Secret Doctrine, we live in the light of our ego. And those that are living in the light of that ego are less subject to the karma of the world than to the relationship they have with that ego. And so again, part of this, which is why we talk about that whole wheel, these are all phases and steps that the ego has to go through and master consciously. Again, the adepts say they go through these states consciously. They have to die or go through the death state, i.e. Robert Crosby's ego that goes through those states, enters into those states, emerges from those states, retains a recollection of those states, and maintains its individual integrity. That is the adept. And that is the practice, and that is the process in company with altruistic service, that empathy, that sympathy, that giving, the exercise of those paramitas that all strengthen those states. Because there comes a time in a weird way when there's nothing on the earth that they might want, except to do what duty they can for the benefit of humanity, and even as one of HPB's teachers said, still love their family.
Mhm.
And before I get back to you, I think Lori, not,
Yeah,
I'm sorry,
Lori had her hand up.
Lori had, was your hand up, Lori?
I was, but I think I might have found the information. I was thinking about how I had heard about higher scandas, not just scandas that block the light. So if there are higher scandas, do they actually block light as well? And how would we release those, or where does that come into play?
Okay, so the short version of that in terms of higher skandhas and lower skandhas, if we use Mr. Judge's version, all manifestation is made up of skandhas. Skandhas arise from gunas. Gunas generate principles, as HPB tells us in 5 Years of Theosophy. So the combination of those principles, if we think in mind of T. Subaril's article on the sevenfold Brahmanic division, those 3 gunas create 7 principles. Those principles are made up of skandhas of different proportions. The classification of personal skandhas has to do with the body, has to do with sensation, the mental factors, the compositional factors that include morals and ethics, the abstract ideas, the idea or sense of a individualized self that is simply an idea, not a true existence, and the fruitlessness of rite, rituals, and ceremonies. And so each of those categories will affect each of our principles. And so those higher skandic tendencies would then be those same categorical tendencies used in a spiritual way, used in a Buddhic divine way, and used in a higher monastic spiritual way. And so they would then provide the formless, because again, when you looked at the subjective entities that we presented, as the teachers say, there are those Dian Chohans that are in existence that are subjective and have no forms, and yet they are present. And there are those Dian Chohans that have forms. And so those forms are made up of skandhas, principles, and gunas. And yet their operation, their abilities, and the magnetic planes to which they are attached, typically as those vehicles, is much more subtle, higher, and inner than the ones that we typically operate on. We've got to remember that the thirst for existence, or tanha, when it's not being driven by personality, are still magnetic links that link us to different planes. The majority of us here are linked and stuck in that fourth plane world matter existence, because that's where we have embedded the majority of our common monastic impressions, seeds, and deposits. There are those that have not done that. And in the context of 5 Years of Theosophy, the elixir of life, when we learn how to reposition those tanhic properties without personal attachment, we really begin to understand how to transition into different planes of consciousness consciously, such that we can appreciate what the adepts do on a daily basis in terms of their assistance for humanity. And I don't know if
Thank you.
you're welcome. Always a pleasure. And I don't know if that's Judy's hands up again or just
No, I need to take it down. Thank you.
okay. All righty. And
Yeah,
then
that's all right. Wonderful
I-
presentation.
thank you. You're
Yeah.
the one woman crew tonight, Laura. What's up?
Sorry. Well, lots of questions, that's for sure. It was a good talk, and I've taken down quite a few notes for contemplation. One of the questions that comes up many times by people who come into the lodge in our study classes is about assisted suicide, end of death.
Uh-huh.
And it seems that with your diagrams that you gave us and all the different stages,
Hmm.
that we, by and large, as a humanity, we don't know enough about the process of death to really use that idea of assisted suicide effectively, that it could be very dangerous. It could actually interfere. And I wondered if you had any insights or into or words that we could share with people in that regard.
Do we have any insights into the issue of assisted suicide? And clearly, based on what we've suggested in terms of suicide, as it was expressed by the original teachers, and what happens during that process, it's not something that is encouraged. But then we've got to recognize several other factors. One is that the life giver is the astral body. That has been ordained by karmic decree in terms of its duration of existence. And that's based on the lives that we lived. So in Patanjali, we get the aphorisms that those karmic deposits determine the species that we are born into, the lifespan that we experience, and the life experiences that we can look forward to. And so if we were going to systematically work with an individual to understand the process before the decision, we would have to understand what that normal lifespan might be, what assisted false living is based on mechanisms, instruments that give us life support, but not quality of life. We would have to consider the cognitive state of the individual at the time. And we would have to, if we're trying to be complete, not impose on them our theosophic view, but elicit from them their spiritual understanding. And then with that information, discuss with them pros and cons, different scenarios of what their life is. What is it that they are really, really feeling deeply inside? What are they trying to leave if it's assisted suicide? Or what is it that they're afraid of? I mean, all of these factors are important because in the end, it's, remember, the skandhas that make up the brain, the astral, the emotions, the feelings, the body, the relationships, and the cycle of time that that ego incarnates into, in addition to the resources and the technical information that's available. That's a cycle. 1,000 years ago, that cycle didn't exist. That choice didn't happen. People died 15 years old, 30 years old. 40 may have been an extended life. And so there's a lot that we really have to consider when we're taking into account the karmic connections and relations in regards to suicide, assisted suicide, the intent, what is the motive, etc. And so for myself personally, I would not tell anyone they were right or wrong. I would walk them through. I would share with them different ideas. I would try to open up their mind. I would ask them what is life to them. And so, no black or white answer, but answers of discovery. Okay, and Jonathan, I think you're kicking me out.
Oh, wow, it is that time. I had a question.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you think that, okay, you mentioned that we go through these different cycles involuntarily, but there are those initiates who go through them voluntarily, these after death states, etc.
Mhm.
Now, with reference to aphorism 28 of the karmic aphorisms, that's the one that talks about how we can't really judge another person's karma. Only an adept can do that.
Okay.
And my person could be going through something that looks really difficult, but they're developing fortitude,
Mm-hmm.
something like that. I was wondering if you could share with us any insights you might have about mental illness in that department.
Okay. Sharing insights about mental illness. And perhaps we can say, I mean, they've got this term that we use nowadays, autistic spectrum. And so that spectrum means that there are steps along the way. And so when we talk about mental illness, we should really think about it perhaps from a spectrum. And we say that only because the majority of individuals, the majority of humans have been through, experience all of these states that we sometimes call schizophrenic, mixed, disidentified, disconnected, dissociative states, depressive states, sometimes manic-y states, feeling better, than other times being very depressed, walking through the abyss, experiencing hell, wanting to kill oneself, feeling murderous towards other people. They're all there. And the question is to what degree we attach to them. So, in that context, we are in an ocean of, let's just say, kama manasic stuff. And this is where an old practice, but currently now reintroduced into psychiatry, mindfulness becomes of value. If there is enough ego with metacognitive skills, by metacognitive, we refer to the ability to look at one's own consciousness without critique, without like, without hate, without fear, without running away, without discontent, no judgments. It's very much the precursor to meditation, to settle the mind and watch, to settle the mind and say, from a different perspective, neti neti. I am not that. This is an experience passing before my mind. What can I learn from it? How can I investigate it? What does it mean? What are its implications? Because in that process of mindful awareness without judgment, without attachment, without clinging, remember the nidanas are contact, sensation, cognitive liking or disliking, attaching or clinging to the determination that one made as a belief as to regards whether it's good or bad. Once we do that, we're stuck. Because now we ride the roller coaster because we've identified with it. If when we contact it, we step backwards and we engage in awareness of it and look at it and examine it and explore it, that's the metacognitive, the cognition of cognition. Then we are in a position to allow it to pass. Because if we use the Buddhist equation, every thought, every moment is born, peaks, dies. What does that imply? It can't last forever. This too will pass. And the more we practice centering and mindfulness without attachment to content, without attachment to emotions, without attachment to the idea of self, the more we begin to achieve a healthier distance between thought, consideration, reflection, and action. And so if we can achieve that state, then there is no mental illness. There's learning, there's examination, there's investigation, there is growth and development and freedom. If we cannot make that separation because we are too much intertwined, like the mango that Judge says most of us are, if we're intertwined in that, there is only knee-jerk action and reaction, reflexive thinking. Most of us live in reflexive thinking. Somebody says something, we have an idea, we don't like it, we're ready to fight, we're ready to run, we just go back and forth. We don't typically stop to say, oh, that's interesting what you said. Because remember, we can interpret anything in any way. That is our freedom. What did Viktor Frankl say to the Nazis, I guess, as the rumor goes? You can do what you want to my body, but you cannot tell me how to interpret the experience. And so even an apparently negative experience can be interpreted positively.
Mm-hmm.
And that was Judge's whole issue with attitude. It is our attitude towards the event and our understanding of that event based on our attitudes. And again, we're back to this idea of beliefs. We have to examine our beliefs because what we believe dictates what we do, dictates how we emotionally feel. Regardless of whether it's real, regardless of whether it's true. That's insanity.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we want to break from that cycle and exercise, I mean, a fast digression. For those that remember the Mahachohan's letter, one of the leading causes to loss of soul was intellectual function.
Mm-hmm.
And what we believe dictates how we interpret things, whether it's right, wrong, true, or not true, which dictates how we feel about things, which dictates how we act about things. And so it behooves us to do the internal search, meditatively, prayerfully, whichever word you want to use, to reflect introspectively on what is it that I really am. Not even a who, because we know that if something happens to the brain, we get hit with the pole, we get a bad concussion, traumatic brain injury, the personality that we think we are changes. So that cannot be what we really are. We use the personality, therefore, that slide on the different aspects of the ego. The egoic consciousness in these different fields. The adepts have merged to some degree that ray with the spiritual ego. And if that spiritual ego underlies all states, they are one with that going through all states. Not affiliated with the skandhas as determining forces, maybe to their bodies, but not to their minds. And so that whole question of mental illness from a, how can I say it, from one walking the path
Mm-hmm.
is very, very different than from one unaware of that path. And one of the things that we can add to this, in Pistis Sophia, all of those elements in the charts related to Kama Manas or Kamaloka, they become the elements, Pistis said in another way, skandically, that literally make up the aggregates of our nature. So if it is not karmically right for us to be that reflective, we will not have the capacity to reflect in that way because we are not on that path. And the path that we are on is a path that necessitates the torture, self-torture of what we've done so that we can learn, because karma is a harmonious and progressive law that is inherent within our being. So hopefully that at least not necessarily answers, but puts it in a field for further consideration such that one can understand the states that we go through, whether mental, emotional, or otherwise, are not the being that we are. And that makes the world of difference.
That is a beautiful answer. Thank you very much for that. It does tie together last week's presentation, which had to do with the justice of karma and the opportunity to learn.
Right.
And you've taken us through all these different states, the after-death states and so forth. This will tie together a thread with next week's topic, believe it or not, which is on the astrological archetype of Cancer, which is different than the personality type. And that ties in with the Nama Rupa, which is, how these signs tie in with the Anidanas.
Right.
And the Nama Rupa does tie in with the Skandhas and the Samskaras and so forth. So that will be the journey that we'll continue with next week on the archetype of Cancer. So it's quite an amazing thread that we're on this journey that we're going through together. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, especially Jean, for a wonderful presentation and
Pleasure.
wonderful and amazing answers. So
All righty. Be well. Thank you.
thank you guys. Okay. Have a good
Thank
week.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.